It is the spring of 1945, and the war in Europe is almost over. American soldiers from the 90th Infantry Division are pushing through the Thuringian hills of central Germany, past burned-out farmhouses and cratered roads. Their unit receives unusual orders. They are not being directed to a battlefield. They are being sent to a salt mine. The entrance is unremarkable, a narrow industrial elevator shaft driven into a hillside near the small town of Merkers. The soldiers descend hundreds of feet into the earth. When the elevator cage finally stops and the doors open, what they find in the darkness stops them cold. The beams of their flashlights sweep across stacked wooden crates, canvas bags, and row after row of paintings. Not a few dozen. Thousands. Gold bars are arranged in blocks several feet high. Bags of gold coins, Reichsmarks, French francs, British sovereigns, American dollars, are piled against walls that extend far beyond what the lights can reach. There are sacks of wedding rings, of dental gold pulled from the mouths of murdered prisoners. There are currency notes from nations the Reich had already devoured. One sergeant later recalled that he could not find the edges of the room because the valuables simply went on and on into the dark, like something out of a fever dream rather than a Tuesday morning in April. Within days of that discovery, something remarkable happened. Not a public announcement, not a press conference. The area around Merkers was sealed. Journalists were turned back at checkpoints. The mine shaft was placed under heavy guard. High-level military officials traveled to the site personally, quietly, and the contents began to be removed under conditions of near-total information blackout. General Dwight Eisenhower himself descended into that mine, one of the few times the Supreme Allied Commander visited any individual discovery site during the entire European campaign. Photographs were taken. Then the cameras were put away. For months, the full inventory of what had been found at Merkers was not released to the public. And Merkers was only one mine. As thorough as the record-keeping was, the complete picture of where the Nazis hid their stolen wealth has never fully emerged. What has emerged, piece by piece, through decades of archival investigation, is something stranger and more troubling than a simple wartime story. The Nazis did not merely steal. They built an entire parallel financial and cultural infrastructure designed to survive the fall of the Reich. And much of what they built still has not been found. The official account that Allied forces recovered the bulk of the stolen wealth and returned most of it to rightful owners is a story that serves the comfort of institutions more than it serves the historical record. What actually happened, as documented across thousands of declassified files, the testimonies of surviving monument men, and the research of restitution lawyers and historians, is something governments have had powerful reasons to obscure. This is not a conspiracy theory. Every element of what you are about to hear is grounded in documented history. The seizure records exist. The shipping manifests exist. The documented facts, lined up in sequence, describe a pattern of institutional behavior so consistent and so deliberate that the word oversight becomes impossible to sustain. Understanding what that something else was requires going back to the beginning, to the moment when the Nazi regime first decided that cultural and financial domination were not merely instruments of war, but its ultimate purpose. Before we go there, if you find this type of story genuinely compelling rather than merely disturbing, consider subscribing right now. This channel exists precisely for this material, sourced, detailed, and delivered in full. There is a lot more where this is coming from, and the stories ahead are, in several cases, even harder to believe than this one. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you do not miss what comes next, because we are about to go into the mine, and you will want to see what is at the bottom. The machinery that made the theft possible at this scale did not appear overnight. It was built systematically over 12 years by the Nazi state and its financial apparatus. By the time the German military had swept through France, the Low Countries, Poland, Greece, Yugoslavia, and large portions of the Soviet Union, the Reich's economic administrators controlled access to the central bank reserves of more than a dozen sovereign nations. The Reichsbank, under Walter Funk, received gold shipments stripped from the central banks of Austria, Czechoslovakia, the Netherlands, Belgium, and others. The Belgian gold alone amounted to more than 200 tons. These were not informal seizures. They were accompanied by paperwork, by signed transfers, by the bureaucratic machinery of a state that understood, even in the act of theft, the importance of documentation. The ERR, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, was the formal task force charged with seizing art, books, furniture, and valuables from Jewish homes, galleries, and institutions across occupied Europe. In France alone, the ERR catalogued and removed approximately 22,000 objects from 203 major private collections. Hermann Goering helped himself personally. His collection eventually included more than 1,300 stolen works of art. The point is that this was a system. It had administrators, it had logistics, it had warehousing, and it had, critically, an exit strategy. The Safe Haven program was a joint American-British-French effort begun in 1944 specifically to track the movement of Nazi assets out of Germany and into neutral countries before the Reich collapsed. Safe Haven investigators documented in real time the transfer of looted gold and currency through Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, Argentina, and Turkey. The Swiss National Bank alone accepted approximately 100 tons of gold from the Reichsbank during the war, gold that Allied investigators later confirmed was partly melted from victims of the death camps. What Safe Haven revealed is that the Nazis operated a deliberate financial ratline, a network of neutral country banks, shell companies, and sympathetic foreign nationals designed to preserve Nazi capital beyond the reach of defeat. The Odessa network, documented by investigators including Simon Wiesenthal and confirmed in declassified CIA files, was one branch of this ratline. But the financial arm was in many ways more sophisticated and more successful. The Merkers mine gave up approximately 100 tons of gold bullion, nearly 3 billion Reichsmarks in currency, over 2,000 bags of gold coins, and a staggering collection of stolen art. The soldiers who entered the mine first described the smell, a mineral dampness overlaid with the faint chemical scent of aged paper and varnish. The paintings had been crated in conditions their curators had carefully calculated to preserve them. Whoever packed those crates expected them to stay there for a while. This was not panicked hiding. This was planned storage. The Siegen mine in the Ruhr Valley contained additional artworks evacuated from Aachen and Cologne. The Heilbronn salt mine held an extraordinary concentration of objects removed from Jewish households. At Altaussee, an Austrian salt mine in the Styrian Alps, investigators found what many considered the single most significant art cache of the entire war, more than 6,500 paintings, including Vermeer's The Art of Painting, Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna, and Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, all 12 panels. The Altaussee mine was kept at a precise humidity to prevent cracking and mold. This was not improvised concealment. This was a sophisticated long-term storage program. The mine had been prepared. The Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section, the monument men, cataloged what they found. They were meticulous. And they noted in report after report that the volumes recovered did not match the volumes in error seizure records. Tens of thousands of objects that the Germans themselves had catalogued as seized simply were not in the mines. They were not in the repositories. They were not in Goering's captured train. They were somewhere else. The urgency of reconstructing a stable post-war Europe meant that following every discrepancy was not, institutionally, a priority, and understanding where the rest went is the story that is still being written. When the Merkers discovery became public, in edited form, the U.S. Army's official response was carefully shaped. The gold was presented primarily as the German state's financial reserves, not as stolen property requiring complex restitution. This framing was not accidental. The distinction between German state gold and looted gold carried enormous legal and diplomatic weight. If the gold was characterized as German state assets, it could flow through established intergovernmental mechanisms for reparations and reconstruction. If it was characterized as stolen property belonging to named individuals and nations, a completely different legal process would be required, one that would expose neutral nation banks, create obligations Allied governments were not eager to fulfill, and make the post-war financial settlement vastly more complicated. The speed with which the Merkers gold was categorized, moved, and placed under Allied Control Council authority within weeks of discovery is itself a form of evidence. Army investigators who tried to press for more detailed provenance analysis were redirected. The Reichsbank records that had been captured were classified at levels that restricted access for decades. The London Debt Agreement of 1953 explicitly deferred the question of Holocaust victim restitution to a future peace treaty that was never signed. It was not resolved, it was deferred, and in the deferral, the window for individual restitution effectively closed for an entire generation. Now, let us steelman the official position fairly. The Allied recovery effort was genuinely remarkable. The monument men operated under battlefield conditions with minimal resources and no precedent. They did recover more than 5 million cultural objects. The Tripartite Gold Commission operated until 1998, continuing to process claims and make distributions. West Germany signed restitution agreements with Israel and Jewish survivor organizations. The Claims Conference, established in 1951, has distributed billions of dollars over decades. These are real achievements, not pretense. But here is what that narrative cannot account for. The Tripartite Gold Commission distributed approximately 337 tons of gold, but documented looting from occupied central banks alone is estimated at 500 to 600 tons. The gap, more than 150 tons by conservative estimates, was never publicly explained. The Swiss banks, under international pressure in the late 1990s, settled for $1.25 billion in a class action suit representing Holocaust survivors whose family assets had been held in numbered accounts. Accounts that Swiss institutions had insisted for 50 years simply did not exist. They existed. The documentation was there. It had been there the entire time. The absence of documents in the story of Nazi looting is itself a form of document. When the ER cataloged seized objects, they created detailed records. When the shipments stopped matching the receipts, when objects in the catalogs stopped matching objects in the repositories, the natural question is what happened in between. The answer, in dozens of cases, traces back not to written records, but to people, retired customs officials in Basel, former Wehrmacht logistics officers living quietly in Munich suburbs, families in South Tyrol and the Salzkammergut, who had purchased farmhouses and lakeside properties from motivated sellers in 1945 and 1946 at prices that required no explanation. Researcher Kenneth D. Alford identified multiple cases where hidden asset locations were preserved not in writing, but passed from the Wehrmacht officer who supervised the burial to the local official who witnessed it, to the adult child who was told as a kind of inheritance, kept secret because disclosure would raise questions about complicity the family could not survive. The Austrian Lakes District, Lake Toplitz, Lake Fuschel, and Lake Walchen in Bavaria have all been subjects of documented searches, some state-sanctioned, some private, all controversial. The bottom of Lake Toplitz is known to contain Nazi materials. SS divers and West German authorities in the 1950s recovered counterfeit British banknotes. Part of Operation Bernhard. Those notes were real. They were found. What the notes were packed alongside, what else went into the lake, remains contested. The Salzkammergut deposits, the Swiss accounts, the Merkers discrepancy, the Tripartite Commission gap, these are not isolated anomalies. The pattern is not random. The losses cluster around specific transition points, assets crossing into neutral country financial systems, Allied administration transitioning to German civilian control. And the moment the Cold War made the rehabilitation of West German institutions more strategically urgent than a full accounting of what those institutions had absorbed, the Swiss banking sector had accepted Nazi gold throughout the war, admitting that fully would have destabilized the entire post-war mythology of Swiss neutrality and undermined legal foundations of numbered account banking secrecy, opening the Swiss financial sector to liability it could not survive intact. The same logic applied to Swedish iron merchants, Spanish tungsten traders, Portuguese cork exporters, and Argentine agricultural interests, all of whom had done profitable business with the Reich. By 1946, the primary strategic concern in Europe was the Soviet Union, not the unresolved debts of Nazism. West Germany needed to be rebuilt and armed quickly. The Krupp family, whose industrial empire had used slave labor from concentration camps, was eventually prosecuted, but their assets were never subjected to full forensic financial analysis. They kept what they had built with what they had stolen. Somewhere in the Thuringian Hills there may still be chambers that no Allied team ever found, The German records showed more than 1,500 separate storage locations for looted assets. Allied investigators documented visits to fewer than 600 of those locations. Nearly 1,000 documented storage sites were never fully accounted for. The war ended. The urgent priority of investigation was overtaken by the urgent priority of governing a shattered continent. Files were boxed and transferred to archives, where they sat, in some cases, for 40 and 50 years before researchers with the right clearances found them. The lake bottoms of the Salzkammergut have not been fully surveyed. Private collections that changed hands in the chaos of 1945 and 1946 are still, in many cases, on the walls of homes. The Art Loss Register maintains a database of more than 700,000 stolen objects and receives new inquiries and new matches every year in the present tense. Every year, a new painting surfaces at an auction house. Every year, a researcher cross-references a lot number against a seizure catalog and finds a match that should not have taken this long to surface. The Gurlitt collection, 1,400 works of art found in the Munich apartment of Cornelius Gurlitt in 2012, demonstrated with brutal clarity that the problem is not merely historical. Gurlitt's father had acquired many of them directly from Nazi-forced sales of Jewish-owned collections. No one had asked, no one had checked. The physical evidence does not wait patiently for justice. It sits, sometimes in museum basements with mislabeled acquisition records, sometimes in the climate-controlled storage of a private collector who purchased in good faith from someone who purchased in good faith from someone who did not, sometimes in the silt at the bottom of an Austrian lake, inside a waterproof container placed there in the spring of 1945 by men who expected perhaps to come back for it. The documentation of what was stolen is incomplete. The documentation of what was recovered is incomplete. The gap between those two incomplete records is where billions in human cultural heritage currently exists. That gap is not a historical abstraction. It is a present tense condition. The families of the people from whom these things were taken are still alive, in many cases. The Washington Principles on Nazi-confiscated art, agreed to in 1998 by 44 countries, committed signatory nations to identify looted works and resolve claims with victims and their heirs. Implementation has been uneven. Dozens of countries that signed the principles have returned almost nothing, citing insufficient documentation, the same documentation that was destroyed, suppressed, or simply never created in the first place. The absence of records, engineered partly by the very institutions now citing it as a reason not to comply, remains the most elegant feature of the system. There is a question that historians and philosophers of collective memory have wrestled with for decades, and it is the right question to end on. When a civilization steals from its own citizens on an industrial scale, when it strips them of their art, their gold, their homes, their identities, and then feeds those stripped resources into a global financial system that absorbs them without reaction, what is the shape of the remaining obligation? The gold moved into Swiss vaults and came out as loans and as liquidity and as the foundation of post-war prosperity. The art moved into private collections and came out as cultural prestige and as the basis of family fortunes. The people from whom it was taken were, in most cases, murdered. Their heirs, those who survived, were told for decades that the records were incomplete, that the funds had been allocated, that the appropriate processes had been followed. What you have heard in this video is not a secret. Every piece of evidence cited here is documented and available to researchers. What has made it feel like a secret is the distance between what the documents say and what the public narrative has insisted. That distance is not an accident. It was engineered by institutions that had every reason to prefer comfort over clarity. It has been maintained by the simple inertia of a settled historical story that most people, most institutions, and most governments have found it more convenient to accept than to reopen. But the mines are real. The lakes are real. The gap between the seizure records and the recovery records is real. And somewhere, in a basement, in a vault, in the silt at the bottom of a mountain lake, part of the $3.5 billion is still waiting. Whether anyone will go looking for it is a question that belongs to us, not to the past. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself genuinely unsettled by the distance between what was documented and what was done, This channel is where you belong. We cover exactly this kind of material, the history that was recorded but not publicized, the paper trails that institutions hoped time would obscure. The cases where the documented facts are stranger and more troubling than anything a screenwriter would invent. Subscribe if you have not already. Hit the notification bell so you see the next one when it goes up. And leave a comment with this. If a painting from a looted Jewish collection were discovered in a major museum's basement tomorrow, a confirmed match against a known seizure record, what do you think should happen to it? The law says one thing, history says another. And the family that lost it has been waiting for 80 years. Tell me where you stand. I genuinely want to know.